This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London. All of our podcasts are available from our website, www.sas.ac.uk.
So, good evening and welcome on behalf of the School of Advanced Study to the Dean's Seminar. The Dean's Seminar is an occasion where we are able to show some of the research that's going on in the school in many different institutes, and we're delighted this evening to have one of the key researchers from the Institute of Philosophy, Dr. Ophelia Deroy. Ophelia is a Marie Curie Research Fellow who is researching into taste preferences, among other things, and has written extensively on philosophy of perception, on synaesthesia, sensory substitution, and she's also one of the linchpins of the Centre for the Study of the Senses at the Institute. And so we're delighted to have her talking to us this evening. Are we all synaesthetes, or what shall we make of arbitrary cross-modal matchings? Ophelia, welcome.
So, yes, the purpose of the talk is to focus on series of strange phenomena that I'm investigating at the moment, which have been related to synaesthesia, and this relation, I guess, is controversial. Does everybody know what synaesthesia is? I'm just waiting. Okay, well, process. Here is basically what the talk will look like. I'll first try and explain the kind of phenomena that are targeted in this talk, which are called arbitrary cross-modal matching. And it's rather, at the moment, a negative category, so it's somewhere where it's a placeholder for a series of phenomena we haven't yet managed to classify. And so they present a challenge for people interested in cutting the mind at its joints and trying to find what the right psychological kinds are. As a hypothesis to explain this rather strange series of phenomena, it has been proposed that these matchings are actually a weak form of synaesthesia. By synaesthesia, just going back to the etymology for a moment, means perceiving together. It's a case of sort of arbitrary putting together of sensory experiences. So you might have heard already of people who report experiencing colors where they listen to music, or having taste experiences when they hear certain words. Other people can have tactile experiences when they eat, when they feel things in their hands. So all this sort of arbitrary, random, idiosyncratic, surprising, rare phenomena have provided the main framework to interpret the first series of phenomena, as well as a kind of other interpretation, which is that they have something to do with the way we tend to classify our experience, which gets a bit messed up. But what I want to do is to suggest that there is actually a third hypothesis which makes these cross-modal matchings much more normal than we think, and more mainstream. So that's the goal at the end. I want to convince you that this is a mainstream series of phenomena. Okay, so arbitrary cross-modal matchings. As I said, the idea is more that these cases are surprising. We have no good explanation for them. They're hard to reconcile with our psychological models, noticeably, and they don't really fit in with metaphysical assumptions that are the basis of our psychological inquiry. So a good way maybe to grasp that, to contrast them with non-arbitrary cross-modal matchings to see what they are not. If you think about the fact that we put together information that comes from our hands and from our sight when shape is at stake, like if you're not at all surprised to hold the glass and feel that it's circular and see that it's circular. If you're in the dark and you're touching this, the image you might have is the image that you would have if you recognize you have the visual image of glass. And so they're good evidence that we put information of touch and sight together relative to, in that case, the same property, which is the property of shape. The same is true for size, so the size you touch tends to correlate with the size you see. And texture is also an interesting property. Here it's not surprising that we tend to put the information, our brains tend to put the information together, because we are targeting, as I just said, one and the same property. So it's a good thing that you have two access to the same thing. And sometimes one will be more accurate, like touch in the dark. Most of the time vision will be more accurate, so it's simply modulated by touch. But we also know of other kinds of non-arbitrary cross-modal matchings, meaning things that for which we have good psychological explanations, which don't surprise us at all when we consider sort of brain wiring. That, for instance, we associate the faces we see with the voices we hear. And that's the way we learn to identify individuals. Like babies will learn to identify individuals on the basis of both face and voice. But also the fact that we put together the smell of something and its taste. So when you smell, for instance, vanilla, you tend to say that this is a sweet smell. And it might even sort of, you might even have a phenomenology corresponding to this sweetness. It might start to smell sweet. So we are really, in that case, putting together the two experiences in a way which is not arbitrary at all. It's because we've experienced vanilla and sweetness together a certain number of times that these two experiences tends to be connected. I'm certainly not suggesting that there is a single phenomenon, neurological or psychological, by which all these associations occur. Of course, the way audition and vision tend to connect is not exactly the same as smell and taste, but these are not important differences. In that case, these cross-modal matchings or whatever unions you can think about are non-arbitrary not because they are targeting the same property like shape, but because two properties like smell and taste or face and voice are regularly associated, therefore it makes sense to put them together. They're coming from one and the same source. So these are the two non-arbitrary things, one property or two properties belonging to one and the same object. I'm not also suggesting that this is it's a nice picture. Sometimes it will be hard, difficult to go back to that, to decide which category some precise case falls into. So, for instance, we tend to think that when we see objects, especially metallic objects, which are red, we tend to think they're hot. So in that case, is that the same property, or is it two properties that correlate? Metaphysical assumptions can come in the picture. The fact that something which is big tends also to be loud. You think these are just two aspects of one and the same property, which is bigness. But you could think that they're actually something which is visual size distinct from auditory loudness. So there's some more fine-grained sort of discussion to be had. But that's still, you will find that these cases fall in one of these two categories. They're not so surprising. Red and hot go together, and size and loudness as well. And of course, famously, philosophers have wondered about these cases. There are lots of interesting problems. Molina, back in the late 17th century, was wondering actually on the basis of which process we would manage to do this non-arbitrary matchings. And to this purpose, he imagined the following scenario of a man born blind and now adult, who was taught by his touch to distinguish between a cube and a sphere of the same metal and of the same bigness, and asked Locke to suppose that the cube and the sphere placed on the table when the blind man made to see, and he asked whether by his sight, before he touched them, he could not distinguish and tell which is the globe, which is the cube. So I'm mentioning this not because I will give a reply to Molina, although maybe at the end I have a couple of suggestions, but because the way Molina's framed this question has actually had a huge impact on the way that the other cross-modal matchings have been dealt with. That's called Molina's inheritance when we come to think about the way the information has to be put together. is divided, structured around three assumptions. The metaphysical assumption, which I started to detail, is that if we put some information together from two different sources, from two different senses, it's necessarily grounded in an objective unity. It's because things out there are one and the same when we put them together. Either, as I said, one property or one object. The worry, of course, was to say that it's the only way for which our perception, the putting together of these two information, would be then true, objective, rational, justified. There's a lot of epistemological burden in Molina's problem. The idea is to say, are we right to do this, and why are we right to think that, for instance, in the dark, when you touch the glass, you're right to imagine it as a circle, and you would be wrong to imagine it as a square. And behind the scene of Molina's philosophical problem, even at the time, there was a huge psychological question. The idea was whether this matching was something which had to do with the fact that we would always encounter these two properties or these two things together. So it was a case of showing that our sensory experiences were shaped by experience only, which was the empiricist thesis. Or if the only way to explain why we would put things together, because somehow we already had the idea of shape being a single property, objects being theirs of joint properties and so on. Interestingly, the Molina's sort of framing of the problem and way of thinking about cross-modal relations has been usually preserved in multisensory research today. When you think about, for instance, this idea that in order to explain, it's still the case in the best models of multisensory integration we have, that we cannot just explain things by exposure and so on. You need to have something which is called assumption of unity, which is supposed to be built in our brains. That is we tend to put, it's as if we are machines which are built with the following rule: put together things that belong to the same object, which is a strong version, or at least things which belong to the same spatial temporal unit. Things that you will perceive in the same location in space and time, just put that information together. If the information starts to be a bit distant in time or a bit distant in space, don't put it together. And that's the way you're supposed to generate the multisensory interactions. And that's also another sign of Molina's inheritance, that actually when you turn to most of the handbooks on multisensory interactions, the arbitrary cases are not even discussed. You just have all the cases as I listed: texture, shape, size, face and voice, in emotions or speech and so on. So they're just considered as totally anecdotal. And one explanation for that is because they apparently don't fit at all with our explanation, which is not strongly in favor of more empiricist options, meaning that we cannot explain how on earth we came to have these strange cases of matchings. We haven't perceived things together. So now I've given you the theoretical framework, but here's a couple of examples to make the category of arbitrary cross-modal matchings more vivid to you. Imagine you're presented with this, not imagine, you're presented with these two circles. And I tell you, like John Sapir back in the 1920s, that one is called Mill and the other is called Mal. Which one is which?
Mal is the big one?
Mal is the big one, okay.
Obviously.
Obviously. So that's a case of, okay. Now another one. Of these two shapes, and this one is due exactly at the same time to Kohler, who's the father of the Gestalt psychology. Of these two shapes, one is called Buba and the other is called Kiki. Which one is which? Again.
Kiki is a spiky one.
Kiki is a spiky one, that's one. Now, one of these, you have to choose which shape to put on the package for a bitter chocolate and the other on milk chocolate. bitter, slightly carbonated water, still water. So here you agree basically with 90% of, depending on the cases. Most people will agree on all the cases I've presented to you. And it starts to be a bit disturbing when you press things further. You could ask tons of questions like that to which people tend to have very convergent replies, like, is a high-pitched sound bright or dark? Bright. When you turn to timbre, which is darker, the sound of the trombone or the sound of the violin? Trombone is darker. This is one of my favorites. Which one is heavier, red or yellow? Red. Okay. So now, this is what we mean by arbitrary cross-modal matchings. Why on earth do we put certain sounds with certain angular and rounded shapes? Why do we put colors with weight? It's not as if you've encountered more heavy red objects than yellow objects. It's not as if the color of the instrument, the trombone, is not darker, the instrument itself, than the violin. It's not as if every time you've heard a trombone, you were, in a dark room, and vice versa for the violin. Or every time you're given a high-pitched sound, I flash a bright light in front of you. Just the very fact, actually, this is also another example, even more frequent, of arbitrary cross-modal matching, that we tend to put certain types of sound high in space and lower in space. It's not only the sources of high-pitched sounds. Think about little dogs, or babies and so, they make very high-pitched sounds. It comes from below. So why do we think about high-pitched sounds as high? That's another case of arbitrary cross-modal matching. So we have, again, to make the point very clear, we have no good explanation for this very congruent, converging answers and in terms of exposure. So it's very strange that how come our brains, our minds, have generated these associations. And they all tend to go back. You can see that all the questions work in the same way. The tendency is that it's not a straightforward association, it's a contrastive association. In the forced choice task, when I give you two possibilities and two other possibilities in the matching task, you will attribute one to the other. If I just ask you, is red heavy? You would look at me in a puzzled way. Now if I ask you which one is heavier, now it starts to work. So these are just tendencies, they are not as straightforward as others. But they have been studied for decades now, and just they are very frequent, at least most documented, between vision and audition. Here, for instance, you can see that high-pitched sounds is related with high elevation, brightness, lightness, angularity, smallness, high spatial frequency, and upward movement. Again, no statistical correlation. So why are they important now? And as I said, I guess just the sheer number of them makes them important, and just the fact that our study of multisensory interactions has been heavily influenced by Molina kind of assumptions should not make these cases less important. But let me try and explain a little more why they really matter. Well, one thing is that they're not just shared among Westerners. They tend to be universal, at least some of them. For instance, the Buba-Kiki effect has been tested in illiterate populations. Because one of the explanations of the matching, which was provided at some point, was that it was not a case of cross-modal matching, but a case of visual matching. The names given to the shapes, if you see Kiki and Buba, have in one case rounded letters and angular letters. Therefore, you would spontaneously match the K with the angular shape and the B with the rounded one. So that would be why we all agree on Buba being rounded. Now, if you don't have any, if you're illiterate, that wouldn't work. And Andy Bremner, colleague in Goldsmith, tested that. And he found it's less, the matching mode is less robust. You have more people being hesitant. They might just also be a bit surprised to be asked this sort of question. They don't see psychologists that often. But it's still usually dominant. They match Buba to the rounded one and Kiki to the. This was done in a tribe in Namibia. They don't, but they still have cars. Maybe they have seen some letters. Another strange aspect of this cross-modal matching is that they appear very early in development. So as early now as they've been documented in babies as young as 2 months old. Again, we cannot ask them, but through some task of preferential looking, you can see that babies are more tempted to look at certain combinations of shapes and sounds than others, and noticeably, so that's a task. 2 and 5-year-old, you can make you can start building scenarios and asking them questions. But in 4 months old here, you can see whether they prefer looking at a bright visual target, which is low in their visual field and makes a high-pitch sounds, or whether they prefer to get a bright, high pitch and higher. And they're more surprised by this one. They don't like the bright being low and low pitch. Same for the shapes. So another even more surprising discovery is that this cross-modal correspondences associations have been documented in chimpanzees. So one way of testing this arbitrary connections in humans, which is not verbally mediated, because of course every time you ask people a question they could be thinking about it, and that might be a bit disturbing. So one way they've been testing is just to ask people in this speedy detection task to press on the bright square as fast as possible when it appears on the screen. And one prediction you will make is that, because it's a visual task, if you give people a background sound, it will act as a distractor. So they should be doing less well, at least as well, if they manage to be very concentrated, or they will be distracted by the sound. What happens is that if you put a high-pitched sound when the bright square appears, meaning doing exactly sort of matching with this arbitrary cross-modal matching, people are faster than if you give the low-pitched sounds when the bright square appears. And here, humans and chimpanzees perform exactly the same pattern. So we're not faster than chimpanzees as detecting bright square when we're giving high-pitched sounds, which is quite surprising. Again, you think that's a very low-level perceptual phenomenon. If you notice the fact that they are universal early in development and that they're present in other species than us, make these arbitrary cases very similar to the non-arbitrary ones. We know that shape matching, for instance, is present in more developed species like rats and so on. They appear very early in development. Some people think that as early as 1 day old. This is a bit controversial, but they look really of the same kind, so why shouldn't we deal with them? Well, another reason to look at them is, contrary to their ignorance, they have been shown to have a variety of effects. As I said, they facilitate detection. If you're given the bright square, you will be faster if you're given as well high-pitched sounds. But they also facilitate word learning, and they have effects in word recognition. Noticeably here, the task that I just presented you with 2.5 years is the task consisted in introducing a new word and providing the child with 2 possible references and see which one he would pick. So he has no idea. Imagine you're given the booba and you're given a rounded shape and an angular one, and they would sort of prefer the case, or learn more when they were given the shape which is congruent with this association. And further studies have demonstrated exactly the same thing, introducing, in that case it's a Japanese study, the verb nosu nosueng is supposed to be correlated with certain kind of movement, and if you introduce it with a movement which is congruent with this association of sound and moving targets, then the child remembers the new word more than if you give it something which is not congruent. Now, in adults, you have the same strange phenomena. If you're given words to identify, and the task consists in saying which one is a real word and which one is not. But as you're passing the test, I will flash also some shapes. Sometimes the shapes will be consistent with the signs of the word. Like there, it's a k, as we see, it's a kiki, so kite will be consistent. And here, for instance, you will have to say it's a non-word, it's a word. You will be better if the shape is congruent with the word, but you will also tend to consider this word more like a word, although it's not, if it's presented with a congruent shape. So it biases, even in adults, our feeling that something belongs to language. So you will be slower here than here. There are more effects in language that make these crossmodal matchings important. Especially here's the bigger thesis behind this. If you think that we have these innate biases in favor of certain signs reference relations, then it looks as if, contrary to what most linguists believe, the word reference relation is not totally arbitrary. There are some tendencies we have which orients us toward certain association. And that's where crossmodal matchings have been suggested to play a role. So this is a very arbitrary nature of language, which is at the moment a controversial thesis, which is correlated with the arbitrary nature of this crossmodal matching. Now, and the last, but not least, of the aspects of these crossmodal matchings, that they surface elsewhere in language. If you think, and I think that Mitchell, philosophers, put it quite nicely, that language has indeed a communicative function, which is basically to update the other state of information about the world, but it also has an expressive function sometimes, which is to manifest or to make others know how we feel, what our point of view is. And it's very difficult when we're talking about certain kinds of experiences, especially, for instance, taste or smell, or the way we feel in front of a work of art, which is why metaphorical expressions tend to be very useful. They help us explaining more the subjective part of experience rather than an objective state of the world. And if you turn to metaphors, they tend to use this strange combination. So you will talk about temperature, you will attribute temperature to colors, or weight to perfumes, and so on and so forth. Again, another place where the expressive nature of language is at stake is certainly poetry, and by contrast with what we call onomatopoeia, which is the fact that certain words have been shaped to resemble the signs of the objects that emit, that they refer to, we also have in language things like alliteration, assonances, which are links between the words and non-auditory properties of their reference. And they're a bit strange to explain. So, for instance, if you take the following poetry, what if a keen of a lean wind plays screaming hills with sleet and snow? It's small, it's bright. The reference is small and bright, but all the alliteration in the vowels especially tend to stress that part of the meaning. What if a dawn of a doom of a dream bites this universe in two? And here you have a poem which works beautifully at this expressive nature, because if you see, it exploits the kind of cross-modal associations that I was talking about. You have more high-pitched sounds, which are bright, small, high, light things, they're referent. Whereas the second part of the poem is sounds which tend to refer to dark, big, low, heavy, compact things. And it's exactly the kind of associations we have. So that's the rather long introduction, thematic introduction to the kind of phenomena I'm interested in. And to summarize, they are more, for the moment, negative psychological category, basically everything which we notice but cannot be learned from the environment. Yet in many other ways they are comparable to non-arbitrary matchings. And they have a variety of effects which make them, I think, important to study. Now, if you go back to the definition I gave about the Molina cases, but they are grounded in objective unity, they are true and rational, and they can be explained either by joint experience or an a priori but rational innate connection, which is, if you think about it, the various solutions which have been given to the Molina problem. I don't know whether you're all familiar with Molina. But either it's supposed to come from regular co-exposure, so old version of Locke of Berkeley, of course there are differences, and nowadays Richard Elder, Alex Byrne have the same idea. It could be a more innate or rational construction, either an innate one in a Kant-like fashion, or via the construction of the common geometry. But so that's the way we think about the non-arbitrary ones. So the arbitrary ones, by negative category, is just thinking about them as not explained by the joint experience of the two perceived features, not grounded in objective unity, and not true and rationally justified, which is, I think, what we need to either change or explain. Now, obviously, they cannot be learned, that's part of the premise, they cannot be learned from regular co-exposure in the environment. They don't have this kind of rational appeal that makes us think that we could have constructed a common geometry, and they're especially not just driven by spatial features. Therefore, we are left with the idea that they should be somehow innate, and that's indeed the hypothesis, the dominant hypothesis at the moment. Makes them akin to a strange, also probably innate, or at least innately grounded phenomenon of synaesthesia. Synaesthesia, as I said, is the tendency, it's not a tendency, it's a phenomenon which is observed in a very small subset of the population, basically less than 4%. People for whom the stimulation in one sensory stream will consistently and automatically elicit a conscious experience in the non-stimulated stream. As I said, the most common examples you find in the literature are colored hearing, people for whom musical notes or sounds, mostly musical notes, tend to elicit color experiences as well as the auditory experience, or people will have the weird experience of seeing black letters in colors. So for people for whom B will be green and A's will be red and so on and so forth. Now, one interpretation for the cases that you presented a minute ago is that they tend to resemble the kind of matching we observe in synaesthesia because they are arbitrary, they appear very early. We have something which is obviously not learned, synaesthesia cannot be learned. And a series of evidence is coming from the fact that both infants and synaesthetes tend to present what we call exuberant connectivity, extra connectivity. So the general hypothesis would be the following: we will be all born with a lot of connections in our brain, and through development and synaptic prunings, most of these connections tend to be to disappear and to be substituted by functional connections. So, but in some of us, they will stay very active, and this will be the strong synaesthetes. And in most of us, they will likely disappear or almost disappear, but remain in a weak form, which is this implicit tendencies to associate sensory features across modalities, also who've never experienced them. So they will be innate and be like remnants of this neonatal sensory confusion. That's the argument would be to say, well, we can find a similar origin. We have no other good explanation in terms of acquisition, and we can have an idea that consciousness in that case comes in the continuum from the very strong cases to the weak cases. We just have the tendency of associating these two things without conscious manifestations in that case. But that's the reply that, at least in terms of psychological mechanism, the synaesthetic hypothesis can provide. That's merely grounded in a neurological fact. And indeed, it preserves the two other assumptions, that it's not grounded in any objective unity, and it's not true, it's purely ad hoc, it's just the way our brains happen to be wired. Now, a series of objections you can make to this hypothesis, even without going into the details of the evidence, is that it's quite strange that something should be innate if they have no function. If you present them as, you know, innate and a few pathological cases or idiosyncratic cases like synaesthesia, that's fine. But you would believe that through evolution, if we have innate features, again, it's not a knockdown argument, but we want to preserve innate features for things which could have been selected. And here you think, why would we have these arbitrary associations? That's not, I think, the best argument we have, because it could be the case that we just happen to be wired in that way, and these audiovisual connections also happen to be useful to develop language or other means of communication. So they could have been selected and be preserved exactly for that function. As I said, there is a lot of over-interpreted evidence. The fact that noticeably kids tend to preferentially look at a series of associations, a series of combinations, doesn't make them exactly akin to synaesthetes. So just the fact that we link the behavior of infants to the behavior of synaesthetes, and we think about the rest of the adults as falling somewhere in between, seems to be an over-interpretation. But that's more detailed stuff. We can go back to this later. But again, and that's maybe the argument on which I want to proceed, is that, okay, could be innate, but we cannot sign for an innate explanation before we are really, really certain that we've ruled out any possible explanation in terms of acquisition. So let's see whether we can try a better shot at an acquisition story before we accept to go for the innate one. And that's kind of tricky, because as I said, they're not. So this is the one we refuse. There is no co-exposure. There's no common geometry. So what kind of other story can we make to make sense of this, the presence of these associations? Now, if you turn to the literature, here mostly in psychology, the only other alternative explanation you find for the presence of these arbitrary matchings is what has been called the semantic coding hypothesis. And I guess if you interpret it in a more sort of wider sense, you can bring together a series of hypotheses which conceive of this matching as all being sort of cognitive or conceptual constructs, which are called intellectual constructs. They could come from a form of analogical thinking. So, for instance, the idea is the way you put these things together, say, high is to low what bright is to dark. Or you were saying that the red is to yellow what heavy is to light. And somehow this analogy makes more sense intellectually, and you could explain why these two things are put together. This interpretation is, for instance, the one that Tremack and Tremack have put forward to explain why chimpanzees are able to do it. And again, if you're asked, for instance, to match red and pink with texture, one which is rough and the other is soft, you would go for pink and soft. Because somehow you have a similar relation between red and pink. One is more saturated, and you can see how it works. The idea is that you can compare a series of experiences. The experience of pink is to the experience of red, what the experience of soft is to the experience of rough. And that's because of this analogy that you will be able to do this matching. Another interpretation, which doesn't reach for the idea of analogical thinking, is just a universal ability that we have of having a common scale for all of experiences. It's a very heavy hypothesis if you think about it. It would be like a mega concept. Like we have this cognitive ability to compare all our experiences on a single scale. That's, for instance, to put the experience of a spiky, pointy shape along with bright and light and dark and heavy, and we have this cognitive, which would then be used as the basis to develop more fine-grained concepts for these experiences. But it's like a polarity base. You will sort out experiences across all modalities alongside a single scale. It's hard to then make sense of this scale in more details, because of course these are the finer concepts that are supposed to be developed on the basis of this one. But it would be something like that. So on one side, you will sort of experience as they're more intense, more dynamic, more unpleasant, and the other side you will put the mild, the static, and the pleasant one. That's Walker and Howe sort of interpretation. So in that sense, here is the reply, or the series of replies given to the three aspects of this matching. In terms of psychological explanation, the matching is grounded in the cognitive skill, which is basically about abstracting similarities. It's still not, if you notice, grounded in an objective unity. It's just the way we tend to classify our experiences. And therefore, in terms of epistemology, well, I think that the verdict is less clear here, because somehow it captures something which is true about us. Maybe that, you know, the things that tend to be more intense tend to be unpleasant. Is that something we want to call subjective or objective? You know, it could be an objective truth about us that we don't like very intense stimuli. Therefore, we have good reasons to put them together. But it's still not as objective as the shape case that it targets an external property. So maybe the verdict on the epistemological side for this interpretation is less clear. But here are a couple of limits for this explanation. First, I think we have good reasons not to grant, at least for the analogical version, analogical reasoning to infants and chimpanzees. So the analogical interpretation seems to be heavy, and I've seen the proximal matchings are witnessed in infants as early as 2 months old. And you think they're doing analogical reasoning, it seems quite costly. Another reason is that because these matchings tend to have an influence on very early stages of processing. If you also think that they have this cognitive basis, it means that aspects of cognition will have effects on early sensory processing, which is something like that I want to resist. I'm not a good friend of this, I hope. But also, when you think about the list of similarities on the common scale, first, we don't have any good neurological evidence that our brains are actually performing such a common putting together of information. It could be distributed, but we have no, it's still a very speculative hypothesis. And at the moment, it looks just like putting together sets of similarities and saying, well, why do we put pointy things with bright lights? Or they look intense. So to look intense, so let's say we put the intense ones on one side. So there's no more than a sort of ad hoc sorting that makes sense of this matching. So this is where we are left. I think, as I said, we have good reasons to object to the interpretation in terms of innate sensory confusion and with the link with synaesthesia. But if the only alternative we have for the acquisition is something which is cognitive, conceptual, it doesn't look like such a good solution. That's why I think that we should be looking actually at as a summary. We are left in this dilemma: either they're innate and synaesthetic, or they're more conceptual. They're still not grounded in objective unity, and they remain either ad hoc or subjective, which are, I think, the two things that we should revise before we can find a good solution to the psychological aspect. Now, here's the idea: why should we think that the ability to put everything on a single scale is something that comes only with concepts? So if you think about the way objects and so on behave, can't we find another common model, if you wish, property that is common to every sensory experience that would help us explain why we put things together, but will not resort to something so conceptual or analogical? And some, in all discussions, and even the common discussions in neuroscience about the amodal categories of experience, one which has disappeared from the list, which was present in the 17th century, or Aristotle even, was movement. There is that very, so we've left space, we've left shape, but we forgot about that very thing. Everything moves in every single sensory experience. Things change and evolve. You can think about smell, and so on. I'm not talking here about action, I'm just saying about the fact it's not active or passive, but if you think about all your sensory experiences and your motor experiences, movements seem to be the most. And what are your sensory receptors doing? Well, they're tracking changes as you move. So that seems to be the most general category. Again, it's a bit sketchy for the moment, but that's the general idea. And the idea would be, well, maybe just pushing that forward. That movements, things that move together, go together, would be the assumption on which information is put together to explain this arbitrary cross-movement matching. Now, we know from a very sort of long-standing lesson we narrated from Kant that people in psychology have adopted, I think, massively. The other day I was talking with psychologists who said, I discovered I'm a Kantian. This is, I mean, they talk to philosophers because they put so much weight on space and time, and information being put together in space and time. It's really the mainstream argument. And I guess when you turn to work like Treisman and so on, it's the same. Object means spatial temporal unity, and we know that our brains do that. But it's not a big addition to think that our minds also proceed on the assumption that features that change together when they move, when things move, and some features change, then you should put these features together. It's just an extra thing on the top of things that move together belong to the same object. And here's, if you go to more fine-grained explanation, how this can explain the cross-modal matchings that I've just described. If you think about it, the higher an object goes, the brighter it will get in most cases, because the illuminant in natural environment tend to be high in space. So it connects high in location with brightness, if you think dynamically, and the higher pitch and the less light it gets. So we'll have, and the smaller size it will have. So all these things are not things that are correlated statistically as properties of objects. They are things that are correlated as properties of things when they change. So the higher is not the property of the object itself, it's the property of the situation, but as something is going higher, you will have all these changes and you tend to put them together. So just one example and to connect a series of cases. One interesting aspect of thinking about movement as being the overarching category that puts these things together for us is that movement is not something, as I said, which is a property of a single object. Could be just a property. The object might not move, it might be you moving, but that's a change you observe with your movement. But that could be also two things that move and do not belong to the same object. So, as I said, the higher an object will get, the brighter it will get. But you could also think about another correlation explaining that in natural environments, again, when you look higher, so as your head is making the higher movement, things are getting brighter, you look at brighter things. In one case, the brightness is a property of the objects you're looking at, and the movement is a property of you. Doesn't mean that you're putting together two properties of the same object. One is a property of you, and the other is a property of what you're looking at. Why do we put, as I said, we had this example of the angular shapes being with bitter taste. When you taste something bitter, you have your face doing this much straight thing. That's an explanation that Charles Spence is pushing also for this correlation. When you have something sweet, you want to go, and you sort of have more rounded stuff. In that case, again, the property of being bitter is not held by the object which has the property of being stretched. It's your mouth being stretched, your face you feel stretched, and the object which is bitter. But that's still a correlation which doesn't hold at the level of single object, but still it is a correlation. And it also works, this idea of things that change together or tend to coincide as they co-change, if you want, not co-occur, but co-change. To explain one of the most discussed case of the Buba Kiki, so basically rounded shapes tend to correspond to this kind of sounds and spiking one to the others. So when you see this, you have these auditory experiences, and they're connected to movements you see on someone's lips. So as I pronounce the word Buba, you'll tend to see more circular shapes, and when I say sounds like Kiki, Iki, you'll have the stretched up, which is also echoed by the fact that, at least if you buy the motor theory of speech, as you're seeing someone utter some syllables, you have a mirror copy, so your motor system tends to mimic this gesture. So again, you will have the same stretched tendency, rounded tendencies copied in you. In that case, it doesn't matter that the shapes you see belong to someone else's face, the shapes, the lip movements you copy belong to you, and the sounds might even come from, in that case, they probably come from the face you observe, but same will be when you speak, and all these correlations are put together indifferently, and in a way which is indifferent to the origin of the property of the symbol source. So that's the third explanation in terms of psychology. Features that change together, go together. And again, we're not obliged to have something more than go together. It doesn't mean that it will be spontaneously, as I said, sort of associated in a strong way. It's just you're inclined to guess what will change together through this correlation. Metaphysically, I think we need to extend our consideration of cross-modal matchings in the following way, that matching is indeed not grounded in an objective unity, but there's still an objective primary quality which can count as an objective ground for this matching, which is movement, which has been actually suggested as an objective primary quality. And in terms of epistemology, then these matchings become perfectly perceptually justified and grounded in terms of experience, not in statistical, as I said, co-occurrence or external regularities, but in the wider sense of regularities. So, as a series of conclusions, arbitrary cross-model matchings at least are not the sign, because we have another story in terms of acquisition that we're all synaesthetic. I think they need to be considered alongside other cases of cross-model matchings. And as I said, the fact that we cannot ground them in learning about external regularities only, or regular co-occurrence, is not an objection to them being considered as epistemologically relevant. Therefore, they're not merely ad hoc or subjective or anecdotal. That's it. Thank you.
Thanks, Ophelia. So, we have time for questions.
Oh, thanks. So that was very fascinating. So, also, I don't really get in which sense your third model is an alternative or new model at all. So, as I understood it, there are kind of two explanatory models in psychology. So, one is associative learning, and the other one is some innate basis. So why isn't this just a version of the associative learning?
Well, because
so you have statistical co-occurrence, just that some of the properties you pick up on are, say, visual properties, and others are properties of your own bodily experience. They co-occur, so you put them together. It seems like a further step to say that well, in some cases we can explain that co-occurrence in terms of the same properties of the objects, but why should you say that that further step is entailed by the psychological model?
Well, first, because to talk about associative learning is not as if we build associations for everything, so they tend to be constrained by the fact that we will put together things that make sense to put together. And the only idea for which people tend to study associative learning is that, well, we tend to associate things that help us predict properties of the object, or predict or estimate a single property. I think that's not, when you say it's not something new, it's not a stretch. In terms of psychological mechanism, you don't need to postulate something totally different from the kind of associative learning in the way people conceive of it, but the way it's a concept is, well, we associate information because it's coming from the same place and time, and it's obviously not the case for this, the solution I suggest, or because or on the top of that, because the function of this association is when you will have one property, it will help you predict the presence of the other, or when you target the shape property, then it will give you another estimate of the same property. So it makes sense in terms of function why we put this together. With the function of this other wider associations that were built, as I said, is really unclear, and you need to look at them in other areas. But there's a second aspect of the reply, maybe I should make clear. What you associate then are not properties. If you think about the way I presented the associative thing, these are, you connect together tendencies for things to move together. So the higher something goes, the brighter it gets. And if you go back to the presentation of these arbitrary cross-model matchings, as I said, if you present them in this kind of absolute, non-comparative way, if I tell you, is the sound of a violin bright? Well, maybe now, I've already asked you the question, so you're biased, but is red heavy? Doesn't work. It works if I tell you, I put things on a scale, and I say, well, imagine you're going for things which are heavier, or you're going lighter in the scale, and take red and orange and yellow, and where would you put that thing? It's these things. The same is noticed for high-pitched sounds being, for instance, bright or dark. If I present you with a 700 Hz sound, and I ask you whether it's bright or dark by comparison with the 200 Hz, then you will say that the 700 is brighter. But if I give you the 700 versus 1500, suddenly you will change your mind and think that now is darker. So these matchings do not connect. They're not targeting absolute properties of the sound, like frequency and so on. They tend to say, well, given that sound and the other, how would they connect? Well, if one was to move in space, to go to reach the other, this is how the other properties will change. So they're targeting dynamic aspects and not just dynamic aspects of objects, but dynamic aspects of situations. Maybe that's why it doesn't look like
you want in your explanations, you want the particular dynamic aspect, property, call it whatever you want, of your movement of your mouth to go together with a particular sound, right? And you want them to co-occur. So there is a statistical co-occurrence, right? And which is important to your explanation.
Yes, that's why I think that's it's not a problem if you have a specific, in one case that they can be built up for targeting specific properties and association of properties. The fact is that, again, I could change your degree of confidence in the matching between the word and the shape, depending on what kind of name I present you with. So in the case of Booba and Kiki, I'm giving you as many cues of going toward the stretchingness of sounds, because, you know, Ki is very stretched and E is very stretched as well. So in that case, you have a perfect kind of, it's sticking, stretch, as if they were properties. But I could give you things like Takiti, which was the initial, and here you would be less convinced because the R, for instance, is not such a stretched idea. So what the matching you're doing is more like, as you're articulating the sounds, does it go rather like a series of stretched sounds or not a series of stretched sounds? And that's obviously it's not targeting each and every phoneme, it's the whole word that does the trick. And the trick is about how you would move your lips as you're doing the thing, and is it more stretched sort of thing?
Would it make a way of joining this discussion, this debate, the two of you? So Thor's wondering why this doesn't just count as another case of associative learning, and it looks as though it does. And yet, when associative learning is pooled into these and similar discussions in psychology, it's usually thought that the associations are tracking statistical regularities in the environment, when the environment is independent of us, and our task is to find out which environmental regularities are such that I can rely on them. And what you're saying is, well, it's not a regularity that's in the environment, it's crossing between things in the environment involving movement and bits of ourselves.
Yeah.
So in terms of how the learning is done, it's still associative, but it's usually just that associative learning is brought in to talk about tracking external statistical regularities, and these aren't statistical regularities. Given they depend on me, they're also going to depend on the particular history I have.
Yeah. One thing is the not necessarily external, not necessarily bound to the same object, and not necessarily then being tracking properties, but ways things tend to change, or which direction they're going, depending on that. So that's the three kind of differences. But I think it's not a huge step like in the case of the conceptual explanation, which certainly has to posit this common scale to compare all the sensory experiences we have, where we have no sort of background evidence of that. So for associative learning, it's not such a big extension. You could say, well, it's just, and I do agree, it's just an extension of associative learning, but still a substantial extension.
Yeah. No. So what I'm taking issue with is just the idea that it should be inconsistent with the associative learning model, which I think it isn't, and I think what Barry is suggesting is that
when did I say that it was
the kind of in the beginning that these examples would be inconsistent. I think you even used that word with standard models, Sandstorm models.
I said they cannot be explained by being learned from regular co-exposure.
This is exactly regularity in co-exposure. Right, so,
but it depends what you mean by exposure. Again, taking the strong idea that these are statistical regularities you observe from external things. So that was tracking statistical regularities in the environment. Maybe that's why I understand like co-exposure. It's like I'm exposed to the shape and the site of the shape, and I put them together. It's not about the way I move toward the shape that explains why I put them together. So it's maybe I should make that more rigid on the co-exposure aspect.
Okay, we have 2 more questions, 3, many more questions. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, this is sort of following on. Maybe the I mean, it strikes me that maybe you're underselling the value of this, because it seems like it's the associative model then that needs correction, because presumably any good model of learning by association should take into account the fact that we want to track statistical correlations among properties of processes as well as objects, since after all processes are something we're very much involved with. So it seems like rather than proposing an account of this phenomenon not based on the associative model, it seems like what you're suggesting is that the associative model is itself in that. And then the problem that it faces for accounting for this, it seems like it's going to face for explaining other cases.
Well, there is other aspects which I haven't tackled here, which, and again, associative learning is a very wide category of people that have different understanding, but at least if you, one strong assumption is that associative learning proceeds, at least in human, what is called awareness of the contingency, meaning that you're supposed to have access to the 2 things you associate.
Yeah.
So, and in the case of this plausible associations, so they're called sometimes, I have no problem calling them association in the most generic sense. We are not aware of that contingency. Before I ask you a forced choice question, you're not aware of putting together angular shapes and certain kinds of signs. So you also need to explain why, if these things are built up by associative learning, some associations then developed and are put in conceptual formats that I associate a voice on the face or tactile shapes and visual shape. So these associations behave in a way which is not the way these associations behave. And they don't surface at any higher level in terms of concepts and so on. And again, that's a difference. They are not associations of ideas, if you want to take the old terminology, because we don't have a distinct access necessarily to that sort of weak change which we are correlating, and we don't have access to the association between these dimensions.
Yeah. I mean, once you pointed out the correlation between the 2 types of change, the movement upwards and movement rightwards, then I do recognize that as an association.
Sure, but here's the intuition I'm trying to capture, and I think we should be sensitive to, is that still doesn't make it as rational as putting together the shape we see and the shape we touch. They don't look of the same kind, so at least there is a difference here. If you just think they're just exactly of the same kind, they don't look to be exactly the same.
Correlation's not as strong though, either.
Yeah, maybe they're just not co-occurring frequently enough.
Question here.
Yes. Perhaps the question is slightly tangential to your talk, but this is something which I have observed, one with regard to taste and other with regard to observation, seeing and motion. The first thing is in certain instances when you taste substances, the initial taste of the substance is not very nice, but in a sense, very rapidly it gets converted in your cognitive system into something nice. So some taste which is intrinsically not nice, in a short while gets interpreted as nice. I mean, to give a concrete example, I have tasted certain pickles and chutneys, which this phenomenon occurs very regularly. And the second one is something to do with seeing that there are certain objects which at the first instance seem extremely ugly. And again, an example of this is certain kind of a sea jellyfish which is found at very great depths. But then after a time, this object immediately begins to swim, kind of in a luminescent kind of light, swim in a particular wavy way, and then immediately it gets transformed into something of beauty. So what I'm saying is,
certainly aspects of your visual experience that explains food acceptability. I mean, this we know at every possible, and at levels of associations that would not fall into the category of this cross-modal association. So, for instance, if you see an insect crawling, you're a bit disgusted, and if I give you a piece of chocolate in the shape of an insect, we know that you will have the same kind of disgust association, therefore you will not be that eager to taste it, although you might taste it and then think, okay, that's okay.
Yeah.
So now what's interesting, where maybe your question relates more to what I was suggesting, that at least when you give people foods that seem to match, whose visual properties seem to match this kind of cross-modal correspondences, meaning bitter taste in more angular shapes and sweeter taste in rounder shapes, or different even sounds, then you can, it will not bear on the negative reaction. Like if I give you something bitter in a round shape, you will not be disgusted, but you might like it better if I give it to you in a square or angular shape. Same for round. So they might have these things might also intervene without it connecting to your category of a disgusting animal or something else.
Question.
Okay. Okay, well, it was a very interesting talk, thank you. I was just wondering whether any known synaesthetes, so word-to-shape association synaesthetes, for example with the Buga and Kiki tests, whether any known synaesthetes had taken those tests, and if so, what the results were.
The problem is that we don't have many word-shaped synaesthetes to experiment with. Now, where the two fields tend to cross is that in the case of word color synaesthetes, which are very frequent, or letter color synaesthetes, their associations seem to match at a large scale, in a large scale way, the kind of cross-modal associative tendencies that everybody has. So, for instance, you will notice that the rounded letters like O and U tend to have brighter colors than the angular ones, and that's also something which is noticed in babies. And you will have strange things, I mean, which are hard to learn. If I ask you which color the letter A is,
Well, I'm colour synaesthetic.
Oh.
So most people who are not synaesthetic will say that it's red. So it's very unlikely that people will say, at least, you know, if they don't say red, they will say orange or something. They will not say black or brown and so on. So you can sort of see associations that people make between shapes and sounds in general, or even shapes and colors or sounds and brightness, darkness, and see that synaesthetes exhibit the same tendencies. So now there are two ways of interpreting that. One is to say, well, we have these weak things and they have it stronger, so we tend just to associate certain sounds with brightness and darkness, when they tend to have not only bright and dark, but also a certain hue, like red, blue, and so on. That's one interpretation. The other interpretation is to say, well, synaesthetes are also subjects to this kind of cross-modal associations. So when they develop their synaesthesia, their synaesthesia gets stabilized, it is constrained by these general things. So here the two phenomena are not the same, and are not on the par on the same line, but one constrains the development of the other, which is why you will have this overlap between the two things. So that's, there are similarities between the synaesthetes and things, but we don't know how to interpret them.
Because it's interesting thinking about sort of learned associations or general, learned associations, because I have words that taste like things that I'm sure I've never tasted in real life, like perhaps chalk or feathers or wool or non-food.
So they could,
and I know other synaesthetes have similar things.
They could be mediated again by other things, but if you must know about the man who tasted shapes. There is this famous case of Michael, who's the neighbor of the psychologist. One day I wrote that when he was tasting chicken, he felt some pointy shapes in his hand, and then he, the psychologist, started to study and report all the associations and test them in more systematic ways. But one thing which is puzzling is that when you read some of the descriptions, they make sense for anyone. Like, mint is supposed to be like a cool cylinder, and there's a kind of smoothness and freshness about mint that everybody can understand. I mean, this seems to be more like a general weird association we've built. I mean, the freshness certainly is something which I have no problem explaining. But the form of, maybe fresh and smooth is one of these cross-modal associations. So what synaesthetes might have is a lot of these general things and something on top of that which is constrained by or mediated, or sometimes why, for instance, we would connect certain words to certain objects might be because of the visual properties of these objects connecting with some other visual properties evoked by the sounds.
Yes.
Yes, I was also following the model you described, and while I think on model 1 was thinking about it, I was thinking, oh yeah, this could apply to a certain synaesthesia, and then, oh yeah, but it won't apply to the certain one, and then we did the second model the same. And I don't know, I thought that it would be possible that in fact it could be like we're talking about two different kind of phenomena with very different characteristics. So, for example, the light synaesthesia, which I think is like the more general one, like I think we have in poetry, and I think you can write less more analytical, and you can prove with the bullying picky, which happened to most of us, and which I think is more about association and it's analytical. But at the same time, I think the way you're talking about the synaesthete, the one, I think just for how that manifests this phenomena in them is, first of all, it's very different. So I think that would be a very different thing from what we have. So that's one thing. And also, I think it's more, it's less, at least from my experience, which is just they don't be like correlated. At least there is the relation is not obvious. And I think that if the origin of linking to experience is just by repetition, it will be much more obvious in a higher degree. But in fact, it's the opposite. In this degree, it is less. It's illogical. It's very difficult to explain. And I think it's more arbitrary. So it's, and also it is. I think that's something also that we explain that that is not. It's not something you get from experience. That some synaesthetes they have sense thing that they never happened before, or they, in fact, sometimes the association is very creative. I mean, if you ask them link this word with this, they will do that. But I think if you ask them an experiment, how could you draw the shape for this world, I think that they will draw a bit more variety of shades.
No, all your questions are absolutely relevant to strong synaesthesia. So the first point, the fact that we might be targeting different kinds of phenomena, that sometimes when people have been talking about synaesthesia for metaphorical associations, then it's not exactly the same as the conscious co-experience. It's totally agree with me. It's more about the way synaesthesia is used. Now, the word is a bit sort of overstretched to encompass many things. The fact that synaesthetes are very good at generating good metaphors doesn't help, because you tend to have synesthetic metaphors. Famous poets had synesthesia or related abilities, therefore to blur. But your second point, third point, one which is that synesthesia in a sense is more arbitrary because you cannot explain it in terms of exposure. And the second, which is related, that you have good reason for not explaining it in terms of exposure, that sometimes the two things have never been experienced together, or you cannot make sense. Now, again, tackling each point separately, some hypotheses which have been put forward to explain synesthesia would be to say, well, maybe because you have this hyperconnectivity, so maybe it's sufficient to have one or two experiences for the association to never disappear. So it's not statistically relevant, but it might be enough that the first, the magnet, for instance, on which you've learned to read and identify and recognize letters, that the A was red and the B was blue and the C was yellow, for you to have memorized this association forever. And although then you will see A's that are not red and B's which are not blue, this association in synesthetic brains never disappear, which is the odd bit, because it should be replaced by new things. So there could be it's not absolutely clear at the moment that we will totally rule out the role of external environment in the shaping of some part of the synesthetic associations. Now, it's certainly not the case, as your third point was pointing, that we can explain every single repertoire of synesthetes through that. First, because we don't have the data, we haven't been around. And second, when you have twins, for whom you think that, in terms of exposure until 6, 7, they have the same genetic material, which is already homozygotic twins, and they've been subject to roughly similar exposure, they've learned to read on the same books and so on. They don't develop the same association. So obviously, exposure matters, but it's not sufficient. So it's something about the random connections, probably, which are created, and in my sense, constrained by this more general.
One of the ideas you put forward was just trying to explain the phenomenon, was just saying we haven't taken into account sufficiently motion, the movements in all of this, and you spoke of some common scale, that we could find some common scale in which various senses might just refer. And referring to this common scale, then we could just, without any analogical reasoning, come to a conclusion. It's a funny thing about it. So my point is, I want to make 2 points. The first point is concerning this relationship between motion and common sense. I mean, because you started saying, well, maybe the modern models for thinking about senses are not entirely relevant. Just let's go back to Aristotle and this idea that there might be some common sense. The second point is to say maybe you're not going far enough along that line, because when discussing the case about a movement, trying to apply your idea about movement as being, the basis of a common scale. You just and talking about bitter, and you say you connected bitterness with the facial expression and smoothness with another facial expression, and they're trying to connect taste with motion. Then my impression was that you were coming outside the mouth, so to speak, just to have a visual impression, allow for your hypothesis about this importance of motion. So my point is, because movement, you say, movement, you've got to have something moving. So what is moving?
Yeah, it's your own...
Yeah. But
when you eat something bitter, I was thinking it's your own muscular...
Oh, feeling inside. Yeah. Oh, so
you feel your own face.
Yes, because I was thinking you were considering the taste from the outside, from your facial expression. But it's, if I did not get that.
It's a reinforcer that if you see someone eating the same thing, you will see them making the same movement. Yeah. So their face will go like this.
Yeah, this is what
basis. But in that sense, you will not be able to connect it with as immediately with the taste, unless you already know what this thing tastes.
Yeah, so that was what the idea was the following. In Aristotle, you haven't got movement only when it comes to local movements, but also you've got, qualitative movements, variation in intensity. So that was just trying to go along your way. Because, for example, when you taste things, movement is relevant, but it's not local movement. It's a variation in intensity. So, that was just trying to go along that way, taking motion as something which could be helpful in your reasoning, but considering motion just a bit, in this larger, with this wider concern. Or
the fact that I left out intensity is because it's a very interesting case. We do connect things of various intensities across senses, and including the duration of a sound with the length of visual lines. So that's the case of, the longer the sound, if I ask you to match, beep and beep, with a short line and a long line. But this doesn't look so arbitrary in that case. Why doesn't it look arbitrary? It's connecting two intensities or two durations, and we can find explanations in terms of already a model properties. Either in that case, it's time and space and intensity in the two dimensions. So the more intense, the higher the magnitude in terms of time, the higher the magnitude in terms of space. And magnitude is an analog property for which we have good models to explain connections and so on. That's also why you will put more intense, probably something like the first case I actually referred to, the Mill and Mal, the visual size. So the smaller circle was between the lower pitch sound R and the bigger circle. No, the bigger circle was between the lower pitch sound and the smaller pitch sound. It's a kind of mixed category because you could think that it's exactly something which these two intensities co-occur in nature, like the bigger the object, when you stroke them, they tend to emit lower pitch sounds. So that's not the most arbitrary cases. I guess it's really the connections of qualities like brightness and pitch, which are not strictly speaking qualities but dimensions of percepts that are harder to explain than connections of intensities. Although all these things will correlate. I mean, space and time and intensity might act on the top of the correlations in terms of things that are moving together. So I'm certainly not saying that movement will substitute or make all the rest irrelevant, but if you just keep that list closed, then you're left with a series of associations that you cannot explain but by innate synesthetic grounding or other kind of higher level comparison. If you add movement, then, and you think all these six things correlate, then you can explain that. So why is that different to Aristotle common sense? Well, Aristotle common sense is not really, at least as we read it, and I'm sure there are lots of controversies about how to read Aristotle, but it's not supposed to be really at the sensory level. It's a sort of more reflective category. So I guess it would come in the second kind of solution, the higher level cognitive capacity of putting things together, and that's not something I'm going to do. That's why we don't choose the term common sense.
I fear we have to stop at that point, but before we thank Ophelia, let me just invite you on behalf of the Dean to join us for drinks, which will be in the lobby of the school, just outside the elevators on the second floor here. And Peter Niven from the school will shepherd you along. But let's, first of all, just thank Ophelia for a very rich talk, fascinating line of research, and clearly there's almost endless and limitless things that will come within the scope of that, but I'm very glad we've got such a clear and receptive and forceful thinker to deal with them. So thank you very much indeed.